Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Hammer Museum. I'm Claudia Bester. I'm the Director of Public Programs here, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's Hammer Forum on Threats to Indigenous People in Latin America Today. Indigenous people across Latin America face widespread annihilation as a consequence of megadams, mining, farming, deforestation, displacement, and genocide. And we're talking about a lot of people. There are, I believe, 240 different tribes in the Amazon basin alone, and we're going to hear more about that. This is a serious humanitarian crisis that's been going on for a very long time, but it seems to be reaching an apex right now as resources dwindle and it takes more and more effort to extract resources from the ground. And climate change is expected to have a disproportionately heavy impact on these populations as well. So tonight we want to discuss all of that and at the same time to highlight the interconnection of human populations across North and South America and the impact on biodiversity and environmental protection. So first we're going to hear from anthropologist Mariana Ferreira, who will also be our moderator tonight. She'll be followed by Sarah Shenker, who through her work with Survival International has worked with many indigenous communities in South America. And then culinary anthropologist and chef Lois Ellen Frank will talk about the link between cultural and biological diversity, the principle of native self-determination, and the defense of ancestral lands and indigenous rights. After our three speakers give brief presentations, they'll have a roundtable discussion and take audience questions. Before we get started, I want to remind you to please silence your cell phones, and please note that taking photographs and video recording aren't allowed in the theater, but we are recording this and we'll make it available if you want to share it with your friends and colleagues. The Hammer Forum is a monthly series of public discussions about current social and political issues, and it's made possible with the generous support of Andy and Branya Galiff. The next Hammer Forums will focus on the alarming increase of murders of Mexican journalists, and then the forum after that is about the reproductive rights of inmates and women of color, many of whom are being forced or coerced into undergoing sterilization procedures against their will. So if you'd like to receive reminder emails about these upcoming events, please sign up for our email list on one of the iPads in the lobby, or you can always find out more on our website. The Hammer Forum is also available on the Hammer website as video podcasts. So you should have all received some note cards and pencils on your way in. Those are for you to write your questions on for the Q&A period. When we get closer to Q&A, we'll send around ushers to pick up your cards and bring them up to the stage. And if you didn't get a note card or you need extras, you can just raise your hand and we'll send an usher to bring you some more. Please be sure to write your questions very clearly so that our moderator can read them. Before we begin the panel, I want to say that we're all right now on Tongva land, and we're honored to have an elder from the Gabrielino Tongva tribe here with us tonight to give us a blessing. Julia Bogany is a member of the San Gabrielano Band of Mission Indians. She's the Cultural Affairs Officer for the Tongva tribe and also the president of the Gabrielino Tongva Springs Foundation and the Curavanga Springs Cultural Center. And you're welcome to join her this Sunday afternoon at an event called Life Before Columbus, which is going to be at the Gabrielino Tongva Springs, which is just down the street near UCLA, this Sunday, October 8th, and we have flyers for that event in the theater lobby. So now please join me in welcoming Julia Bogany.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to have our guest here this evening. I will be opening with a short blessing. Tai honuka ionak te hovetaha. Yoyavoy te hovetaha. Dear Creator, we just thank you for this evening and for traveling mercies. We thank you for the speakers, for the Hammer, for all the people that are here, each family represented. We ask you to just be with us tonight and just help us to learn together and to appreciate each other more in this world. Awishkahe.
So now I'd like to introduce our moderator for the evening. Dr. Mariana Ferreira is a medical anthropologist from Brazil who uses critical theory, including theater and pedagogy of the oppressed, to protect the human rights of indigenous peoples and other minorities in North and South America. Her most recent books include Mapping Time, Space, and the Body, Indigenous Knowledge and Mathematical Thinking in Brazil, which was published in 2015, and Acting for Indigenous Rights, Theater to Change the World, published in 2013. Dr. Ferreira is currently a professor of medical anthropology and associate director of the School of Humanities and Liberal Studies at San Francisco State University, where her main goal is to advance and protect the human rights of indigenous peoples. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mariana Ferreira.
Thank you, Claudia, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the continuing threats indigenous peoples in Latin America, North America, and all over the planet face today. I'll also briefly present from a human rights perspective my work since 1978 as a mathematics educator, practical nurse, and medical anthropologist in Brazil, the US, and now in Chile. Indigenous peoples' rights are human rights. That we know. I'd also like you to join me in celebrating some of the victories and accomplishments that indigenous peoples have achieved worldwide. One of those victories was the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, known as UNDRIP. Adopted by the UN General Assembly on September 7, 2007, after 30 years in the making by indigenous peoples themselves. 10 years ago, after much anticipation and hard work, this important piece of international legislation finally became law. Even if in its weakest form of a declaration without binding power, rather than a convention or a treaty. We will make it into a convention soon for sure. However, there are challenges to its implementation, what we are calling threats. For starters, I'd like to call your attention to the concept of a people. A people is the equivalent of a nation, and thus its plural peoples, as in nations, rather than a tribe, natives, Indians, or populations. A notion of a people carries within it, in international law, the right to a territory or land, an independent government, and the collective right to be recognized as a distinct human group. The U.S., for instance, refers to indigenous peoples as tribes or populations for fear the term peoples implies the right to independent statehood, according to international law. All discrimination needs to be eliminated because indigenous peoples face some of the most complex challenges of war, ecological and economic breakdown, and food and water insecurity. The UN recognized the need to adopt special measures to protect the world's 37 million indigenous individuals, who are present in all continents and in more than 90 countries. The world map of indigenous people population reveals 40 million individuals in Latin America, representing hundreds of distinct nations, and 6 million in North America, what I'm going to focus on, and also the speakers. 6 million in North America, very well represented too, with about 1,000 different peoples, nations, in the United States and in Canada. So that's incredible cultural and ethnic diversity. The failure, however, of state parties to respect and implement the UNDRIP, the declaration I mentioned, is a principal cause of treaty violations, resulting in pervasive human rights violations. Impunity is the main cause of human rights violations across the globe. Among the rights guaranteed in the Declaration is that of free, prior, and informed consent, known as FPIC, a requirement essential to indigenous people's right to self-determination, that is, to make decisions that affect them directly or indirectly. The question then becomes, what are indigenous nations themselves doing to protect their rights and live with dignity? First and foremost, I see it as a matter of human rights education, because if we don't know our rights, then we don't have any. That's true for everyone, meaning that there is not a single human right that I am entitled to and that you are not entitled to as well, because we're all human. Article 14 of the Declaration, UNDRIP, says, Indigenous peoples have the right to establish and control their educational systems and institutions, providing education in their own languages, in a manner culturally appropriate to their cultural methods of teaching and learning. Further, Article 15 stipulates that Indigenous peoples have the right to the dignity and diversity of their cultures, histories, traditions, and aspirations, which shall be appropriately reflected in education and public information, which is what we're doing here. So let me now give you a glimpse of my work in South and North America with distinct nations that include the Xavante in Central Brazil, where I first started at 18 years of age, the Guarani in southern Brazil, the largest indigenous people in the country with about 50,000 individuals, the Yurok in Northern California, and most recently the Mapuche Nation in Chile, who number 1.5 million persons, 18% of the Chilean population. Who would know that? I'd like to add that all photos in this presentation were either taken by me with permission or else given to me with permission. Now, to a selection of projects I choose to highlight, identifying not only the challenges but also the accomplishments of the peoples I have been working for. So let's move to some of the projects that I chose to highlight. The first one, funded by the, I don't have my notes here, but funded by the United Nations Development Project starting in 2003, was called Flowers and Fruits in the Brazilian Savannah and in the Xavante Experimental Kitchen. Why was I back there in 2003 after having started there in 1978? Because I became a consultant for the Xavante people, and since I've always been interested in mapping, here we were mapping the territory and the plants and fruits and seeds, and then bringing them into a Xavante experimental kitchen, because the women were involved. They say, well, why don't we start experimenting with this? And many of these specimens they didn't have access to for many years because of all kinds of stuff that I will talk about. And so here we have, okay, the seeds, collection of seeds. And as a result of this, because indigenous peoples, the Xavante, were taking things into their own hands, and when you have that, you have a retaliation because the farmers are not happy with that. We're doing GPS training. The women are collecting seeds. We're doing seed tray. We're doing like harvesting stuff, cooking stuff, and, you know, overcoming all that oppression. Meanwhile, this, so that they would make it very clear that we're not about to just go around doing that. And if I'm a missionary, Joaquim Aradezur was executed. Joaquim Aradezur was executed in April 2003 by who we know who, the big soy king in Brazil, who's the big soy planter there in Mato Grosso, Brazil. And here are some images that the kids drew, and here is him joining the world of the dead. Okay, so agribusinesses is the main so-called threat to the Xavante in central Brazil. Plantations of soybean, which we export to China mostly, rice and sugarcane plantations, and cattle ranching. If you look at this image, this satellite image, you see that the Sangrador, which is one of the 13 lands or reservations that the Xavante inhabit, you see it as an island of green of preservation, and all the red, pinks, and white spots, those are deforested lands where you have cattle ranching, et cetera, that pick up the heat. The satellites pick up the heat, and that's why they're white and pink. So you see that the Xavante, if you look at the maps of Brazil, the areas where it's the greenest is where indigenous peoples are. Okay, the action. What action? Okay, so we did GPS training by Xavante youth. So these teams of Xavante youth were mapping the environment using GPS, and we didn't have cell phones, so it was just not like cell phone anything. And we created all kinds of educational materials, which what I'm invested in, such as this book of maps of the Xavante Association, funded by the National Foundation of the Environment in Brazil. Okay, second project that I chose to highlight, I think this is really important because it connects, Latin America to North America, was actually my doctoral dissertation at UC Berkeley, UCSF, on historical trauma as a determinant to high blood sugars, meaning that you can analyze and predict the fact that if people, for example, have, been kept, this is what it's doing, it's skipping to the other one, that have been, colonized, sent to boarding schools, put on reservations, massacred, because there are mass murders there too. It's not just, the shooter somewhere. No, these people were massacred. Some were extinct, basically. And I followed along 20 Yurok families, and our protagonist here on the far right on top, Molly Rood, she was one of the persons who was incarcerated, because it is incarceration. On boarding schools. And meanwhile, what's going on? Oh, logging. Hey, logging. They're tearing down the forests. And the Yurok and other populations there are known as salmon people. Why? Because their major way of subsistence is fishing salmon and sturgeon and other things, acorn mush and stuff. But of course, that now with global warming and all the dams up the Klamath River, owned by multinational companies, by the way, have thwarted that mode of subsistence. And I wrote a lot about also the similarity between the medical, the pharmaceutical industry, and casinos, and that Molly Rood, our protagonist that I introduced you to, she said, we pop pills like coins, hoping to hit the jackpot, to one day become rich. Great, the action. What is the action that the Yurok tribe is taking to promote culture, language, education, history, fishing, and forestry on the Yurok Indian Reservation and around that too? For example, with youth summits and, youth declaring, I am proud to be an American Indian, rather than I'm ashamed and want to hide my Indianness. The other project I would like to highlight is map making in southern Brazil. I'm from southern Brazil myself, and when my kids were growing up and I came back for my doctorate here, we started, doing some educational projects on these Guarani. It's not lands, it's not territories. They live in shanty towns and on, freeways and, in the city of São Paulo, they're like slums. Favelas, as we call. So my kids started telling me, Mom, you know what they play? I said, what were you doing with all day? Oh, we were playing ambulance. We were playing hospital. We were playing, scabies treatments. What are you talking about? Yes, and we go to the dump. And I'm like, oh my God, go to the dump. What do you do on the dump? Oh, we go there to collect toys. What are you talking about? So the fact that I had kids, and then I started asking the moms, why do your kids roam around and don't go to school? So I started and the kids developed a series of drawings because we were, doing all kinds of quality curricula and developing curricula for the schools. I was coordinating that. And, the world that they would like to see. Actually, they want to change the cultural order based on their cosmology of going to the land without evil, without dying. Well, that doesn't exist because everybody ends in a cardboard coffin. Anyway, the monsters, how are they going to face the monsters? And what are they going to do? They're going to make little armadillo things, traps. Action. Improve health situation and secure land. There are also a lot of different indigenous peoples in southern Brazil. São Paulo is the richest industrial state in South America. Why is it that all the peoples that live around the city, inside, there are 3 indigenous lands inside the city of São Paulo. They're so-called reservations or lands, territories now, around the city of São Paulo. Why is it that they're the poorest? Well, I guess all know the answer to that. But there are other peoples here, and our action now is to improve the health situation and secure land, which I can give you examples. If I had time, I'd give you tons of examples of how that's becoming true. Another very interesting project that I was recently engaged with, I worked as an expert witness for the nations of the Xingu Indigenous Park, which many of you may have heard of. Why? Because it was created by the military during the military dictatorship in Brazil to encapsulate, to confine all these so-called tribes into a space where the international dignitaries like the prime ministers of that could come and see naked Indians running around. Even when I was a math teacher there, they'd say, the minister of the prime minister of I don't know where is coming. We want everybody naked to take pictures. Yeah, it was like that. Anyway, so shamanic map making in the Brazilian Amazon, it is about working with shamans. Shamans are, it's a common word for ceremonial and political leaders that have a lot of clout, a lot of power because of their wisdom and their generosity and solidarity, by the way. So here is, on the far left here, Rondó, who is a member of the Suya people in the Xingu Indigenous Park. There's him again, dressed as a jaguar, because that's where he gets his power. His double, he's a jaguar and a human, because there's that perspectivism where you can be both animal and human. And he says, our power comes from humans and animals. And this, when they were presenting the court case to me, which we won, by the way, they were allowed back into their ancestral territory after 50, 60 years of being displaced. And they did this whole sort of performance in which they were showing me, and they're almost like, it was very ceremonial, very sacred, all dressed up. And meanwhile, the other shaman on the far right on top, Intoni, who's the grandson, I think, of Ramda, he was drawing everything, because that's what we used to do. You don't try, they're learning how to read and write in Portuguese and in their language, and so we produced several drawings. Okay, this is the last project that I'd like to highlight, which is the latest that I've been working on with the Mapuche people in Chile. I've always loved Chile. It's like right next to Brazil, and I was, shared. And it's just amazing to think that the Mapuche people are 1.5 million strong, as we say, they're 1.5, which is 18% of the Chilean population. It's just like amazing what a big nation they are. And there are others. There are the Aymara, the Quechua, etc. So I was invited just recently by the Mapuche of southern Chile to help develop curricula, not only for Mapuche schools, as I say here, but for the Aymara and Quechua themselves. So what were we doing? We're going around visiting the schools, and the center of the Mapuche world is in southern Chile in a place called Lautaro, here on the left. And so this school here, which is in Lautaro, and you have Mapuche girls giving us a demonstration of how they're picking up this ancient knowledge from their grandpas and grandmas who are still alive, and which consists of creating a system of documenting everything that goes on in your life. It's kind of like akin to the quipus of the Incas many, many years ago. And so basically what it is you tie these strings together, and then you start tying knots. And depending on the size of the knot, because you can roll it around and then pull it, and then it becomes a big fat knot. So that's like 10 units, or you can make a little knot, and then you can tie strings of different colors. You start recording everything you have, just like a bookkeeping sort of system. And it was incredibly popular with the Incas and other peoples, and the Mapuche are just bringing that up again. So this was a demonstration in a school in Lautaro. And then we got together here in Temuco. Temuco is another big area also in this district here of Araucaina in southern Chile. So we got together with the mayor and so-called medicine women. They have other names, they call them machis. The machis who are participating in this community-based participatory research project called CBPR, which is very different from what anthropologists used to do, which was like what we call helicopter research. You go there and you pick up the information, you go back to your university. This is a participatory community effort when communities and their partners participate together in every step of the research project. From the inception, what are we going to do? Oh, we're going to create curricula for Mapuche schools. The design, how are we going to do it? What are we going to do? How are we going to do it? The implementation, now that we know what we're going to do, how are we going to implement it? The evaluation, did it work? What didn't work? How could we improve it, etc.? And the publication and dissemination of the results. This is being funded by UNESCO, Spanish foundation called Fundación SM, and will begin shortly in 2018. And finally, my ultimate goal is to strengthen the rights of indigenous peoples using education as a tool for self-determination. And the works that I cited, the projects that I chose to highlight here, are both present in two of my recent books that Claudia mentioned. Acting for Indigenous Rights is available for free online, by the way. You can download it. It's a teaching manual. There are 80 learning activities that are all spelled out, time, materials, based on 4 plays, because I became a playwright also because of one of my kids. And so I wrote plays about these stories that I meant, these projects that I told you, materialized in short stories and plays. So this is one of the books. And the last book that I just published, Mapping Time, Space, and the Body, Indigenous Knowledge and Mathematical Thinking in Brazil. It's a more scholarly book, but it reflects on all of these findings and all of these teachings from and by indigenous peoples. And this is available at sensepublishers.com. So thank you very much. And that's what I had to say.
Thank you, Mariana. And now I'd like to introduce Sarah Shenker. She's a senior campaigner at Survival International, the global movement for tribal people's rights. She's also spent she had spent almost a decade working with Indigenous people, helping them defend their lives, protect their lands, and determine their own futures. Sarah coordinates Survival's Uncontacted Tribes campaign, which leverages the support of supporters in over 100 countries to ensure that uncontacted tribes' land is protected so they can choose how to live. She runs Survival's groundbreaking Tribal Voice project, which gives tribal people a platform to speak to the world. She's visited many Indigenous communities in Brazil, Venezuela, Paraguay, Mexico, and India, and she just got back from the Brazilian Amazon and will update us on the situation there. So please join me in welcoming Sarah Shenker.
Thanks very much, Claudia. Thank you, everybody. I'm really pleased to be here this evening at Hammer. Across South America, Indigenous peoples live in many different ways and in many different environments. But the common theme, the common thread, is that they all depend completely on their land for their survival. And I've spent time with many different tribes, as Claudia mentioned, and I've seen so clearly how they thrive when their land is protected, but how much they suffer when their land is stolen and destroyed. Today, I want to focus on uncontacted tribes because they're the most vulnerable. In fact, they're the most vulnerable peoples on the planet. Uncontacted tribes are tribal peoples who have no peaceful contact with mainstream or dominant society. And in our interconnected world, many people find it hard to believe that they exist. But they do, and there are more than 100 uncontacted tribes around the world, in the Amazon rainforest, in the remote forests of West Papua, on the arid plains of Paraguay's Chaco region, and also on the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean. They are our contemporaries and a vitally important part of humankind's diversity, and they have an acute understanding of their environments. For example, they use hundreds of types of plants for medicinal purposes and for house building and for other artifacts. And uncontacted tribes are the best guardians of their forests, as we also saw in Mariana's presentation with the Shavanchi. We see with uncontacted tribes evidence like this satellite image of the territory of one uncontacted tribe in the western Brazilian Amazon. The orange line is the border of the territory. We see that inside the territory, the forest is nearly intact, is pretty much intact, and outside there is a sea of deforestation. So the best way to prevent the destruction of the Amazon rainforest is to campaign for the land rights of tribal people, especially uncontacted tribes. They depend completely on their land, and their land depends on them. And their respect for their land and their deep connection to it can be seen in their religious and shamanic rituals, and it can also be seen in their everyday lives. For example, in the way that they'll move their crops from one place to another to allow the soil to replenish. And well-known Yanomami shaman and spokesman Davi Kopenawa, who some of you might have heard of, once asked, "Why is it taking so long to believe that if we hurt nature, we hurt ourselves? We're not watching the world from outside. We're not separate from it." And in many places, uncontacted tribes coexist with nature at an extraordinary level. This uncontacted tribe in the heart of the uncontacted frontier, which is a region on the Brazil-Peru border, home to more uncontacted tribes than anywhere else on the planet, appear to be healthy and thriving. We can see that their bodies are painted red and black with paints they make from the urucum seeds and the genipapo plant. And they have baskets full of papaya and manioc fresh from their gardens. And here and elsewhere, uncontacted tribes point arrows up at passing planes to show that they don't want contact with outsiders. The uncontacted Yanomami Indians on the Brazil-Venezuela border also seem to be healthy. This photo, and the previous one actually, was taken from a government overflight to monitor the land. And here we can see the Yanomami's communal house, which they call their Yano, in which each square section is home to a different family, where they hang their hammocks and where they store their foods and where they light fires to keep warm at night. But in many places, there's a darker story. It's a story of genocide. And I just want to show you a scene that I saw for kilometers and kilometers on end as I was approaching the borders of the territory of the uncontacted Kawahiva tribe this summer. There are loggers and ranchers all around this territory, and for me this scene showed exactly what the uncontacted Indians are up against. And it's not just the Kawahiva tribe. Many uncontacted tribes' territories are being stolen and destroyed. Loggers, ranchers, miners, oil and gas companies, drug traffickers, mega dam construction workers, and others are invading these territories to make quick profit. And in Brazil, this is the current president of Brazil on the top right corner, President Temer. In Brazil, we are currently seeing an added threat. This is particularly important given that in Brazil there are more uncontacted tribes than in any other country. But under President Temer, uncontacted tribes are in an extremely dangerous situation. There's a nationwide emergency for indigenous people in that President Temer is very strongly allied to many anti-indigenous politicians in what they call the Bancada Ruralista, the rural lobby group in Congress, which is pushing for a series of draft bills and plans and proposals to open up uncontacted tribes' land further for so-called development projects, for large-scale mining, for mega dams, for military camps, and for all sorts of things. And they are also slashing the budget of the Indigenous Affairs Agency of the government. So this is an extremely critical situation for Indigenous people, particularly uncontacted tribes, and it's the worst situation that they've faced since the military dictatorship in Brazil. But it's not a new phenomenon. Whole tribes were wiped out by the European colonization of the Americas, as we know. And during the gold rush, the rubber boom, the decades of forced contact expeditions in the 1970s and 80s in particular, more tribes were wiped out. And it's continuing today. Yet more tribes are being wiped out by this genocidal violence and by diseases like flu and measles brought by the invaders, to which uncontacted Indians have no resistance. It's illegal, and it is a catastrophe that uncontacted tribes are facing if their land is not protected. So I'd like to share with you now the story of Wiraho Awa, who is a man of the Awa tribe who was living as a nomad, uncontacted in his forest, but who was forced to make contact with a settled, contacted indigenous village in 2015 after his forest was invaded.
Ai vai crescer. Ai promosi ya. Ha. Mak kerja ya. Mak kerja ya. Ya mai kerja ya. Ya mai kerja ya. Ya. Ai be. Haji punya ka bija. Ha. Sama. Makan tiap saja. Ya. Kuat ikau umat biarin. Akrete me mayu kerja. Dạ. Happy pio kacawan. Happy otak ng kwatin na. Kuya ko makin. Aw kwatin na. Ipayok pastu mama takang mo na. Ika ako na. Ikam siya na. Yakamia na. Ha. Anyo yakamia na. Ya ikam ni ba. Abay ya ay jadi aja. Harum jadi dah. Hajar ori aja. Anu udah ka. Kalbi. Ha. Ugi. Awu ka pa ya. Ha. Awir ka boya ja. Ikat tu baby da ai ja. Kia ya apa ikurong ni ba? Sa kari ka tu timika. Biu ja ai wi to ja. Ai chi pe mi kwa ai yo pi wi ba ja. Wi what? Awir to ya ja. Ha. Awir to ya da. Ame ayu chi ja. Ame ayu chi pe i buru ba ja.
Wiroho had been living with these two women, Yakarawai on the left and Amakari on the right. He'd been living with them in the forest, and the three of them made contact together in 2015 after these invaders had destroyed so much of their forest. And soon after that first contact, Yakarawai and Amakari fell seriously ill with pneumonia and tuberculosis. And I happened to visit the settled, contacted community where they were living a couple of months after first contact. And I was so shocked and sad to see them lying still in their hammocks, motionless, unable to eat or speak. And I took this photo to raise the international alarm. And thousands of people around the world then lobbied the Brazilian government to provide urgent health care. And the two sisters, their sisters in fact, they survived. So, of course, that was a little bit of good news. However, well, then they returned to their forest, actually, which was very illustrative of the fact that uncontacted tribes want to be in their forest. As soon as they were better and as soon as they could, they decided they'd return to their forest and live uncontacted again. And they covered their footsteps when they went so that other people couldn't follow them. And for me, that's quite illustrative of how determined they are to live on their land. However, when I returned to this contacted, settled Awa village just now, a couple of months ago, I heard the sad news that Yakarawai has since died. And the thing is that following forced contact, many of the Indians end up in tragic situations like this one. This man is believed to be the only survivor of a tribe massacred by ranchers decades ago. You can make out his face in the bottom right of the image. The photo was taken when government agents were monitoring his land and they approached him, but he backed off, refusing contact, showing he doesn't want contact. He lives on his own in a patch of forest, actually the patch of forest that we saw earlier in the satellite image, and he's known as the last of his tribe. When he dies, a whole people will be lost forever, will be wiped out. And cattle ranchers massacred nearly all the Akunsu, the uncontacted Akunsu Indians in the 1970s, and then they bulldozed their houses to the ground so that people wouldn't be able to find evidence of an attack. Soon after this forced contact, the Akunsu numbered just 7 people, and now there are only 4 of them left. So within a few decades, they will be extinct. And these are the last of the Kawahiva tribe. The footage was filmed again by government agents during a chance encounter with the Kawahiva, and they are living on the run in their forest. They're completely surrounded by loggers and ranchers. And Indigenous people who have recently come into contact with mainstream society tell horrific stories of attacks. Some Sapanawa Indians made contact with government agents and with contacted Indigenous people a couple of years ago. And this short clip is the moment that they made that contact.
Dabi!
the Sapanawa said via an indigenous translator that so many of their relatives had been killed during the latest attack that they didn't have time to bury all their bodies and that they were eaten by vultures. And in the Peruvian Amazon, Jorge Murunawa has another tragic tale.
Raban batir mano rabano no mu pano wadia no da ade mu wadia no date ho rais son tama sto yo date ho que au cara raya da so atorau rau pibão so kas badat so pang date ba atorau waja bada ho date.
The Javari Valley in the western Brazilian Amazon, in the uncontacted frontier, has been in the news quite a lot recently. So some of you might have seen the news of a reported massacre by gold miners of about 10 uncontacted Indians in this indigenous territory, the Javari Valley. An investigation is currently underway. But the point is, whether or not the investigation manages to confirm anything, the point is that such an attack is highly feasible in the current context in which uncontacted tribes' lands, especially in Brazil, are just not being protected. There's a complete government absence. These government teams whose funding has been slashed, as I mentioned earlier, they're not doing their work to do their expeditions in the forest to work out where the invaders are and to evict them. And that is, of course, drastically increasing the risk of attacks and genocidal violence against uncontacted tribes. For all we know, an uncontacted tribe could be being attacked right now as we speak. And I think it's really important to remember that our consumption of things like gold jewelry, of petrol for cars, of wooden furniture and more are fueling uncontacted tribes' genocide. And it's our responsibility to let them live. They have the right to choose how they live. And also, they are absolutely vital. Uncontacted tribes and their lands are absolutely vital in our fight against climate change and environmental degradation. So the solution is clear. The law must be upheld and their lands need to be protected so that they can determine their own futures. This is the sign that you see on a border of an indigenous territory when it is indeed protected, at least on paper, when it is mapped out as an indigenous territory. Of course, that's good, but it's not enough. The borders actually need to be policed to prevent invaders from rushing in. And another thing that's very important to note is that some people think that uncontacted tribes are doomed and that they should be contacted forcibly for their own good. There are, in fact, some anthropologists here in the USA who are proposing that idea. But no, that's an extremely dangerous and arrogant idea that could wipe out whole peoples. Fortunately, government policies now order the protection of uncontacted tribes' lands. So we need to make sure that that actually happens. Uncontacted tribes are well aware of the existence of the outside world. So if they want to make contact, they can and they will. But we need to guarantee their right to live as they choose. It's a right enshrined in national law and in international law and surely also in human morality. For nearly 50 years, Survival International has led the global campaign for uncontacted tribes' rights, and alongside contacted Indians, we've secured countless successes for uncontacted tribes. For example, the creation of the Yanomami territory in the northern Brazilian Amazon, which is the largest forested indigenous territory in the world, and the eviction of thousands of loggers from the territory of the Awa people in the northeastern Brazilian Amazon, and the encouragement of binational government cooperation to tackle this urgent situation. So what we see is that international pressure does work. With the support of thousands of people around the world, we can push companies to reject projects that harm uncontacted tribes, and we can encourage the UN and other international bodies to take a more urgent stand. And we can pressurize governments to protect uncontacted tribes' land. One way in which we do that is that we publicize indigenous people's own actions, and this was an incredible protest by Brazilian Indians a couple of years ago. You can see a copy of the Constitution here, and they're protesting against the ripping up of their rights in the Constitution. They're protesting against all these anti-indigenous plans that are currently being debated in Congress. And in Brazil and more widely in Latin America, actually, indigenous people are coming together and they're uniting and they are shouting out louder than ever before. And in many cases, they are succeeding in winning battles. Another thing that we do is that we generate media attention as a way to catalyze a groundswell of public opinion and grow the global movement, to pressurize those companies, those international bodies, and the governments. So we depend completely on supporters around the world for that. And one thing that we did recently was that we ensured that the reported massacre in the Javari Valley Indigenous Territory made headlines around the world, including, for example, in the New York Times and the BBC, so that these events are known about around the world and they don't just pass by in silence and with impunity. And we give indigenous people a platform to speak to the world about their lives and their lands and their uncontacted relatives, for example. One of the ways we do that is through our Tribal Voice project, which Claudia mentioned earlier, which encourages indigenous people from anywhere in the world to send us 1-minute video clips talking about whatever subject they most want to tell everyone, and we then release them. This is particularly important given that we are not indigenous, survival, we are not indigenous, and we don't represent indigenous people. Another thing that we do and that is helpful for uncontacted tribes is that we work with contacted Indians who are protecting their uncontacted neighbors. For example, the Amazon Guardians of the Guajajara tribe. They are protecting their uncontacted Awa neighbors who live in the same territory as them. They go on expeditions to stop the loggers, to destroy their equipment, and to send the loggers away from the territory. It's pretty incredible what they're doing. It's also very dangerous. They constantly receive death threats. 3 of them were killed last year alone, but they carry on because they are determined that this is the only way to prevent their uncontacted neighbors from being wiped out. We can let uncontacted tribes live. We can make a difference. We can give the most vulnerable peoples on the planet a chance to survive and thrive. So, of course, I'd encourage everyone to join us, to join the movement. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And now our final presenter, Dr. Lois Ellen Frank, is a Santa Fe, New Mexico-based Native American chef, a native foods historian, culinary anthropologist, educator, James Beard Award-winning cookbook author, photographer, and organic gardener. She's the chef and owner of Red Mesa Cuisine, a Native American catering company specializing in ancestral Native American cuisine with a modern twist. Since receiving her Ph.D., Dr. Frank has spent over 25 years documenting and working with the foods and lifeways of Native Americans in the Southwest and other regions throughout the Americas. Dr. Frank is a culinary ambassador diplomat with the U.S. State Department and the Office of Cultural Affairs, where with Chef Walter Whitewater of the Dene tribe, she's traveled to Ukraine, the United Kingdom, and Russia to teach about the history of Native American foodways, work with food as a form of diplomacy, and educate how the Native American food contribution changed the old world. Dr. Frank also works with the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine on a program called The Power to Heal Diabetes, Food for Life in Indian Country, using the ancestral Native American diet for health and wellness in Native communities throughout the Southwest. She's a consultant with the Cultural Conservancy on their Native Foodways program in the San Francisco Bay Area, and is an adjunct professor at the Institute of American Indian Arts, where she teaches 1 semester a year about the indigenous concepts of Native American foods. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Lois Ellen Frank.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. My name is Lois Ellen Frank. I'm from the Kiowa Nation on my mom's side, and I'm Sephardic on my dad. So I grew up multi-ethnic, multicultural, multi-food. I'm going to talk today about the importance of indigenous foods and the idea of returning to this ancestral diet to restore Native American seeds. Seeds are life. The concept of food is our medicine, the metaphor that what we eat is who we are, how we live, and traditional Native American foodways. And I want to bring together the idea that the North and the South are interconnected. I'm going to focus today on corn, although there's so many other foods, and editing was probably the hardest thing to do. Corn is probably the most important of all the ingredients to the Americas. From as far south as it'll grow to as far north as it'll grow, it's what I consider to be the essence of life. It is the indigenous grain. It is one of the most common ingredients that tribes use and have used and interconnects us and ties us together. And once corn was established, 9,500 years ago, give or take, Native people were able to revolve and find ways to have literature and art and many different ways of being surrounding corn, science, and religion. And I'm going to talk about an indigenous way of being and bring in some concepts tonight that you may or may not know, but I feel it's important that you walk away with some knowledge of this. Indigenous food culture is, I think, one of the most important metaphors for my case in point. Here we see corn hanging, we see a mural of corn, we see a woman holding corn that's been soaked in ash to remove the skins to make masa. And that same corn, thousands of miles away, in a pueblo in New Mexico, is being processed and harvested in the same way, which is very important. Traditional ingredients, including on the right, you see pozole, which is the Spanish word for hominy, corn that's been soaked in ash. You can see in the bottom photo that there's ash in the background. And we actually worked with UC Berkeley to have this nutritional ash analyzed, and it's full of calcium. And when the U.S. government came in and told Native people that we needed milk powder, we didn't, because our ash, our traditional way of preparing food, gave us the nutrients we need. We can see that corn is used not only as a food source, that it goes much beyond that. And beyond that, it's used for ceremony. It's used as an offering. When we take something, we offer corn. So corn is mother, corn is maiden, corn is healer, corn is food. And so this metaphor between the North and the South ties this way of being together. Here you can see an Apache sunrise dance, and corn pollen being used as a girl makes her way to become a woman. I want to establish that the way of being, especially in the communities that I work with, is through oral tradition. And oral tradition has always been discounted as a petroglyph or a pictograph, and that it didn't have the same validity as Western science. And I want to say that that's wrong. That the oral way of being is just another way of science. It's a native ideological way of sharing. And so Native historians were able to commit to memory, how to live, how to plant, how to harvest, how to do 1,000,001 things. And that these are very, very important characteristics that need to be carried on. Food is our medicine. It's the woven together like a beautiful fabric of who Native people are. And so how do we do this? There's something called TEK, and some of you may know this, you may not know this. It's traditional ecological knowledge. So the other speakers talked about other areas, but there's knowledge surrounding how to live in the forest. If you were all dumped in the forest, you couldn't live there. You don't know how. This is native science. This is a native way of being, and this is integral to cosmology and identity. And so when we look at how to keep alive traditions and revitalize them, this knowledge, this native science is very, very, very important. And this is how we counter these threats. This is how we keep these traditions vital. And so this is a really easy, good way to understand TEK. Cosmology, the way we look at the world, factual observations that elders made, management systems, right? Native people, the abundance that you saw the forests, right? The abundance, Native people have always managed. You don't rape and pillage. You don't cut it all down. You don't burn it all down. That's not Native. That's not a Native ideology, and that's not a Native way of being. Past and current uses, we saw plants, we saw flowers. How do we use them? And then ethics. My elders, my protocols, I can't go and take something. I have to make an offering. I have to ask permission, whether it's a plant, an animal, or a being, and then use that. And that is who we are. That's the culture and identity. So this is a really good way of understanding this very vital, important knowledge that is part of Native ideology. In Native American cuisine, and I use the French word cuisine, and I've struggled so many years with this because I was told Native people don't have a cuisine. And when we deconstruct the French word, and I specifically use the French word, it means foods prepared on a regular basis from a specific region or locale. Yes, we do have Native American cuisine all over the Americas. And this is vital to keep alive and vital, important. There's the pre-contact period, and I don't mean pre-contact with each other, because we know we had extensive trade routes. I mean pre-contact with Europeans. Then we have contact. So we can look to the south and say it was the Portuguese. We can look on the eastern seaboard and the western seaboard, and we can say it was the English. We can look at the Spanish coming up through the Caribbean and into Mexico and into the southwest and say it was the Spanish. And we can see the French going into Canada and coming down, and that was called the fur trade cuisine. And so first contact, the government issue period, relocation, displacement, what was issued, what were Native people forced to eat to survive. And then the new Native. And as a chef, this is vital because for the first time in history, Native American chefs are being trained equal to their European counterparts. And we can, in our own voice, in our own language, in our own way of being, say what Native foods we want to keep alive and how we want to present them. And that's really important. And for me, that's the exciting part. You know, we're in a great time to be able to do this and see these successes. So I want to just mention the Magic 8. These I call the Magic 8 in 1491, and we have, very crucial years, 1491, 1492, 1493, and we're coming up to the most erroneous holiday in the United States called Columbus Day. Newsflash, Columbus did not discover America. He accidentally stumbled upon America while looking for India and black pepper using faulty maps. Bingo. Okay, that's what really happened. He manipulated the truth, and we did have this period of exchange. 8 ingredients, corn, beans, squash, chili, tomato, potato, vanilla, and cacao, did not exist in the Old World in 1491. These are inherently Native from the south to the north, and these are foods that Native people gave to the world. And in most curriculums, nobody knows this. Nobody knows the Italian didn't have the tomato, and the Irish didn't have the potato, and there was no chili in East Indian cuisine, and no Asian food had cuisine, and the French had no confection using vanilla or cacao. Didn't exist. So very important. We also know, using Western science, so radiocarbon dating, so archaeology, so that's digging. Anthropology is the study of the living. Archaeology is digging, studying those that passed. And so we know by scientists at University of New Mexico in 2009, a vessel was discovered in Chaco Canyon, and the vessel was theobromine. Theobromine is the marker for chocolate. Chocolate was in Chaco Canyon over 1,000 years ago. How did it get there? Because it didn't originate there. Native people walked it there. Pre-horse, pre-contact. So all of this is just hugely important. We can see land and the attachment to land and the TEK surrounding how to grow food to feed your people with no water. Dry farming. We can see irrigation, and we can see using the rivers and using different kinds of irrigation to make crops to feed communities. This is Native science. This is vital to surviving and to mitigating these threats. We can see the three sisters, the metaphor not only for every nutrient known to sustain human life, but how they grow. This is what permaculture is. This is sustainability. This is corn needing nitrogen from the soil and beans giving nitrogen to the soil and squash with big leaves shading the ground, preventing weeds and keeping moisture in. This is native science. And this has been around for thousands of years. And so we can learn. And we need to learn and understand these ways of being. We can see dry farming here. We can see a huge harvest. We can see that harvest being a pit dug in the ground and hundreds of ears of corn being steamed overnight and then saved for use throughout the year. We can see the fungus that grows on corn. And that fungus, called corn smut by the Hopi, called wheat la coche by our relatives to the south. And I don't know if any of you have ever eaten this, but it's a trend right now. And years ago when I was here living in Los Angeles and I was a commercial photographer and I was like, oh, we have to find some wheat la coche. And everybody's like, what is that? And I had been to Mexico and I had been to South America and everybody uses it there. But the native people up here don't use it or they use it differently. And so we can look and see that this fungus is the corn caviar. It's the mushroom. It's delicious. And so we can see other recipes. The idea of cooking bread. This is the oldest known cornbread recipe on the planet, dating back thousands of years. Peaky. Cornflakes were taken and made from this. We can see companies that see something that's native. Swanson Foods, frozen foods, is Inuit knowledge, right? They saw native people putting food in the snow and freezing it, and boom, they formed a multi-billion-dollar corporation called Swanson Dinners, using native technology. And so what we need to do is include the native voice in this and give credit where credit is due. Because most often you eat something or you see something or you experience something and you have no idea of its origin. It's native. The grandmother, old and new can work together. I love this photo because there's that Walmart bowl. There's that plastic bowl that she's really attached to. But there she is also cooking her traditional foods. And so how do we live in 2017 and 2018 in these modern times and still revitalize and reclaim these indigenous foods of the past? I don't think we need to go back. I don't want to live off the grid. I don't want to live in buckskin and teepees like my ancestors did. I have an iPhone. I have a great computer. I teach on a college level in a Western environment. But am I native? Yes. Yes, I am. And so all of these, heirloom corn, how important it is to the land, to the indigenous foodways, to health and indigenous spirituality. And when we change this, when we genetically modify this from its traditional form, and seeds were always more valuable. We didn't have currency, we had seeds. Seeds are life. Seeds were the money, right? So now this GMO, or this idea of genetically modifying something and making it into something it is not, threatens and impacts the culture. And so we need these seeds to stay alive. And there are many examples of seed banks and saving and trading, and we still do this. And this seed exchange is vital to this connection to the land. So native foodways, they're a harvest of gratitude. They're an integral part to health and wellness. We have this connection. Without the ability to grow, to harvest, prepare ancestral foods, indigenous peoples all over are forced to move to cities to get jobs, and the surrounding TEK related to those plants and those ways of being are lost, or in instances, severely disrupted, furthering the health disparities that we see today. And so here are old foods made modern, right? This is what I do as a chef. This is what I create, ancient recipes. And I want to bring in the idea of ceremony, the idea of using a way to honor, the dances, the prayers, the regalia. It has a meaning. And it's to honor the land. It's to honor the connection to the land. And it keeps vital, these connections. And so you can see a young buffalo dancer, right? Why is the buffalo so important to the tribes of the North? Because it was desecrated. I'm sure all of you know that black and white photo where there were piled up buffalo killed, not for food, right? The skull, the photo of all the skulls. And so when we revitalize this food, we revitalize everything connected to that. So what happened? The US government forced relocation. You know, when we interact with the state, we see, as in the case of the distribution of non-indigenous foods, we see the health disparities. This is where they're born. This is where they begin. And I consider this a form of nutritional genocide. When we deviate from those ancestral foods, it's nutritional genocide. We become fat, obese, we have diabetes. And so when we return back to these foods, we have to know what they are. But when we return back to them, we see huge success. There's a movement. We talked about, the other speakers talked about this movement. What is this movement? It's land, it's seeds, it's farming, it's cooking. It's revitalizing cultural, spiritual, and physical connections between the environment and the community for health and wellness. We can see examples of using technology, using drip irrigation. We can see hoop houses. We can see planting of trees to feed our own communities and having excess to export to those of you that want. And that's important because all of you can participate in this. We can see a specialized corn, right? A need for recognition of the support for the link between the cultural and biological diversity. When we keep alive this specialty corn, we learn how to process it, we learn how to feed our people, and we learn how to have enough to share with all of you. And that creates economic viability for those tribes that perpetuate that particular strain of corn. So we need education. We need to reclaim the foods, revitalize cooking, educate students and from as little before they can talk. Well-rounded culinary professionals, workshops, create an overall awareness. And we're doing it. We're teaching if that cord has been broken, if that TEK is gone, we can show communities how to use it again, how to use it, how to make these foods without the lard, without the giant corporate influence that we see today. And it's beautiful. We can see corn soup, corn mush, corn salad. We can see women, we can see men. We can see the defense of these ancestral lands and that it's an indigenous right and it's an integral part of this movement. We cannot be anywhere without our land. And so there's a new paradigm. It's shifting. What's the new paradigm? We activate the TEK. We create and embed indigenous links. We transition from only Western to Western and Native. We start to teach it in our schools. We recover social values. We use different methods and strategies. And I think we saw some of those in the previous two presentations. And we strengthen community partnerships. Local, tribe, state, government, anywhere we can. And then we identify these resources to create safe and fresh and healthy foods. My students always say, if I live across the street from Whole Foods and I can't afford to shop there, is that access? No. And so regardless of whether you grow up in the city or whether you grow up on your tribal lands, this connection is vital. And so we can pass this information on to our youth. We can make this movement the principle of self-determination as an essential ingredient. And I use the word ingredient like I'm making a recipe for life, a recipe for the future, a recipe for 7 generations to come. And this influence, without the outside influence, sovereign indigenous nations will perpetuate health and wellness the way it was in the past. And so the connection really between the land and the people is inseparable. You can't take it away. And we saw that in these talks today. And so everybody can play a part. We can choose to buy wild rice hand harvested from the Ojibwe people. We can choose to buy the tepary bean from the Tohono O'odham Nation. We can choose to participate. And that's what's so exciting, is that there's room for everyone, all colors, all people, all forms. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for beautiful presentations. That was so informative and just incredible to realize how interconnected we are. But not just between the North and the South, but the East to the West and all over the world for that matter. So I'm sure that you'll have some questions to ask us in about 20 minutes when we begin with our Q&A. Or maybe less than that because we're running a little late. But please, do you have your cards, and are you taking notes and asking questions that the ushers will bring us up here so we can then proceed to the Q&A? But I was going to begin with you, Lois. Okay. And you mentioned that, there are more similarities than there are differences between indigenous peoples, not only in North and South America, but all over the world. And one of the, as an anthropologist, and I know you are too, that we have explored how culture within anthropology and other disciplines as well has always been equated with difference. They are from a different culture, therefore they're different, and a focus on behavior too. But what you brought up is that there are more similarities than there are differences. And one of the similarities that I've noticed in my work is this economic system of what we call gift giving or gift exchange, which is based on solidarity and generosity. And one of the examples, as you brought up and we all know very well about here in our work, is the exchange of, for example, foods, but seeds in my case, and in yours too, with corn and other foodways. And so could you talk a little bit more about that, about this system of gift giving and the obligation to give, which is what triggers the circulation rather than the accumulation of goods. And this is a characteristic that indigenous peoples all over the world still hold to very tight, even in the face of capitalism, which we know is, renewed profit forever. So could you talk a little bit more about, the solidarity and generosity that goes on in these systems?
So I'm going to bring in a personal note, and I think my mom instilled in us from a very young age that even if you were to share your last meal, what little you had, that the Great Spirit would bestow upon you more by sharing. And that this exchange, this sharing, is that when we break bread, we become family. And when we become family, we're related. And when we're related, we can't hurt each other because we're in the same community or the same tribe. And so I think this idea of exchange, this idea of sharing food, is about creating relation. And that relation is integral to all of us surviving. We need each other. We all need each other. And, as I travel on a global level, we cannot speak the same language, and we can have completely different political views, but we can sit down to the same meal. It's a human need that we all share. So I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, very much. Because, and when we talk about gift giving or the economy of gift exchange, we're not just talking about gift as material goods, but we're talking about gift as status, emotion, and vehicles of other orders of establishing these relationships. And that's what TEK is all about, isn't it? Like sharing the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, of First Peoples. So thank you for that. And for you, Sarah, what I wanted to ask you about real quick is that you were talking about uncontacted peoples. And in my experience working in central and northern Brazil, I always heard first whispers, but about how the peoples there of the Xavante and the others that I mentioned in the north were going on these secret little trips to help some people out. And first, they weren't very clear about it. And then I learned, because, I was working there as a math educator, et cetera, practical nurse, and I heard that they were bringing them news about what was going on, because a lot of these so-called, we call them isolated in Brazil, these isolated peoples, they weren't sure if they should engage in contact with the broader Brazilian society. So it's not that they're completely isolated, because they're in contact with peoples who, at the end of your talk, you mentioned that Survival International tries to bring up the ways in which they're being protected by other indigenous peoples. So they're isolated from the perspective of the broader, in our case here, Brazilian society, which I think is like 50 to 60 or 80, maybe small indigenous groups that are so-called isolated. So what are the ways in which you have learned from your work with Survival International that these other more contacted groups try to protect the ones that are still isolated?
It's true that uncontacted tribes, isolated tribes, are very aware of the outside world, and they will sometimes, in some cases, have a little bit of contact with other indigenous people who live in the area. When I hear about those sorts of episodes, though, they usually tend to be very sporadic and very quick. Like, I'll hear stories of contacted Indians going to hunt in a particular part of their forest. Because, of course, in many cases, these territories are shared between contacted and uncontacted tribes. And you'll hear stories of contacted Indians going to hunt and hearing a noise in the forest and realizing actually they're quite near the uncontacted Indians. They didn't mean to be, because often now they realize that they sort of want to be left alone, so they don't go near. And they'll exchange sometimes a few shouts, a few words. Sometimes they'll understand each other if they're of a similar language. Sometimes they won't. But it's very sporadic. But yes, the Amazon Guardians that I mentioned are doing this inspirational work to protect their uncontacted neighbors. There are a few other cases of similar initiatives, but on a lower scale in different parts of the country and possibly in the continent as well. But what I think we might see in coming years is that this is a path that other tribes, contacted tribes, might follow, as the pressure on the land is intensifying so fast, because uncontacted tribes' territories are often, in some parts of the Amazon, they're the only places where you can still find valuable hardwoods like mahogany and others. And so the pressure on these lands are intensifying, the government is absent, so I think this is a pathway we'll see more and more contacted Indians trying to find whatever ways possible to help their uncontacted relatives survive.
Interesting. Well, I saw some, I experienced, but I also know of initiatives, for example, in the extreme north of Brazil, where the equator cuts the tip of the state of Amapá, by the way, there's a people there called Waimiri Atoari, and when in 1985, I think it was the Summer Institute of Linguistics or something like that, contacted, which is a branch of the Wycliffe Bible Translator, by the way, here in the United States, they found a tribe called the Zoe, and they decided that, they were going to Christianize them, et cetera, and the Waimiri found out about that. Why? Because the Waimiri knew about the Zoe already, because they were in contact. So they made a video in which they went back to Waimiri, who were contacted, 50 years ago or something like that, and they say, this is what progress and development is. They're going to promise you a school. This is our school here, falling apart, et cetera. This is our so-called pharmacy. All drugs expired, et cetera. And this is what you're going to get. And they made a video. And so then they traveled to Zoé territory, and they showed it on these TVs attached to these batteries. And they said, this is what you're going to get. So you need to weigh this. The second video that they made, because you show the sign, this is protected land, and the title of the video was, Signs Don't Talk. And a lot of people don't know how to read. So it's like, there's no use. And they were used as like shooting targets. People used them to like wash clothes on top. So signs don't talk. So there were a lot of different, and even our school, when we started tracing all the maps that I was talking about, they would say, we have to go tell them we have to teach them how to trace maps. And they would come back. And so this secret group that nobody was supposed to know where they were, so they would be protected from gold miners, timber companies, et cetera, we're starting to draw maps because it would be important at some point to show, as the new constitution of 1988 in Brazil does, that if you've lived there since 1934, which was the previous constitution, you have the right to your ancestral land. So we would study things in school, and they would go in secret little missions with note cards to tell the people, wait a minute, school's problematic. And then there's oil company. Oh, when we started learning about oil. So all kinds of different ways in which to make their voices heard and their rights protected. Yes. Wonderful. I think since it's already 9, perhaps we want to open to Q&A and get the cards with the questions. What do you think? Or do you have questions or comments you would like to make?
That sounds
Yeah. Open to questions. Can we have the cards, please? Yes. So wonderful evening. Thanks for being here. Great. So I'm going to take a little look at the cards and see if we have questions in common. And any specific questions that you might want to add. Okay, so we have GMO seeds. We have democracy, introduce Survival International, maintain contact and support to the angels, indigenous that protect. Okay. And not Giorno. Okay, I'll make a comment. So we have a Mapuche. And
Shall I make, while you're looking at those, Mariana,
yes.
shall I make another comment actually?
Sure, of course, go ahead while I'm looking at these. Yeah.
Related to your last point about Indigenous people showing others what sort of lives they might lead or not lead if they make contact. And going back to one of the points that I made in my presentation about some people saying that contact should be forced on uncontacted tribes so that they can be integrated into national society. Of course, as I said, that's very dangerous because many of them could be killed or the whole people could be wiped out by doing that. But the other point that's really important to remember is that what happens to indigenous people when they are supposedly integrated. And the Guarani tribe that Mariana mentioned earlier, the largest tribe in Brazil in terms of population, 50,000 of them, with hardly any land because all of their land has been stolen from them. So this is the kind of the other extreme, if you like, from uncontacted tribes. The Guarani are the other extreme in that they have had contact for a long, long time. But so much of their land has been stolen and is now being used for agribusiness, for massive soya plantations and sugarcane plantations and cattle ranches. And this is leaving them living with extremely high rates of malnutrition, with the highest suicide rate in the world, their leaders being assassinated for their campaigns to return to their land. So this is what we actually at Survival we call progress can kill. And this is a very dangerous effect of land theft. And it's another thing that we have to bear in mind when people say, well, integrate them and they'll be fine. No, that's not true.
I'd love to take your lead and just bring it. So, we have these borders, and I work a lot with the Pascua Yaqui tribe, which is a tribe that is in southern Arizona, but also in northern Mexico. And when we talk about, these dangers, what's really fascinating when we look at health and wellness is that the tribes to the south that have retained their, and I'm going to use a word that's very problematic, but I'm consciously using it, a peasant diet, which is corn, beans, and squash, and the ancestral foods, don't have obesity and diabetes, the same as their northern neighbors who have identified with the mainstream United States, the burgers, the fries, the steaks, the potatoes. And in that community, it's not if they're going to get diabetes. It's when, because they're going to. And children as young as 10 have type 2 diabetes. So they identified with the colonized mentality, foods that were completely unindigenous, the agribusiness, the idea of eating commercial meats and foods that are completely unsustainable and completely not native. And now they're unhealthy. They're fat and sick. So we can see the influence, and we can see this idea of what do you identify with and how does that identifying affect you or your community. And I think we see that both in the North and in the South.
Great. So one of the questions that connects with what you just said and taking your lead here is that for us natives, it's best to give and ensure others are whole and happy. Much of this revolves around food. So how do we minimize or deny salt or sugars that are detrimental to our health? And I think you may have many examples of that.
Well, sugar is probably the most problematic ingredient on the planet. Native people didn't use sugar. We see it in mainstream, or certainly in the United States, in everything. And so how do we mitigate this? How do we not use it? We read labels. We become educated on labels. We don't subscribe. You can work the periphery of the grocery store. We actually do tours now with community members into the grocery store because it's very confusing and very luring. So how do you eat with the periphery? How do you take something simple? How do you use a slow cooker and make a pot of beans? You know, and your taste buds, salt and sugar and fat, are developed from a very young age. McDonald's has a plan, guys. They want you to eat their food. And so they're adding ingredients. Eating Well just had a whole thing on the heroes of 2017. And one of the heroes was the CEO of Panera Bread. They've taken out 96 ingredients, and now all the other fast food people are following. Right? So it only takes one visionary to say, let's start to omit it. So start to decrease that salt and sugar slowly until you acclimate to the taste, the sensual taste of a peach. If you've ever eaten a ripe, organic, farmer's market peach, it's an orgasmic experience, guys. It's sensual. It's juicy and lush. And oh my gosh, right? So that's where we want to go back to these sensations.
Do you bring up some of these orgasmic sensations in your cookbooks?
I try, but you really have to experience it for yourself.
Because one of our audience members says, how can we find one of the Native American cookbooks that you mentioned?
So there are some cookbooks. We are working on more. We actually have mynativeplate.org. I'll have to look up the exact website. I believe it's nativeplate.org through the PCRM. All the recipes we're doing are downloadable for free, from how to make corn mush to adding nuts to that, chocolate to that, fruit to that, to how to make a great stew without the pork or the pork bones or any of the commercial meats and use only the indigenous ingredients. So it is available. So if you look at the Native Food Program or Native Food for Life, you're going to see videos and recipes that are free.
That sounds great. Now here we have for you, Sarah, some questions about the work that Survival International does to not only maintain well and alive the so-called angels or protectors. What do you call them again?
Guardians.
Guardians.
I quite like angels.
They are quite like angels. I bet they are. What do you do in your work in Brazil to make sure that these people are supported by internationals so that they, can keep this exchange of knowledge between themselves and the so-called uncontacted peoples to keep strong and to make decisions as nations should?
Well, when I go to Brazil, I spend time with people in their communities, and I spent time with the Guardians, walking through their forests with them, understanding what they're up against, seeing the deforested areas, seeing the trucks of loggers trucks, dozens of them passing all the time, completely loaded. We work with them to understand what they're doing for their uncontacted neighbors, to hear directly from them so their voice can come out. We record, film with them. And then what we're doing now is we're publicizing their actions. In fact, a few weeks ago, they did something really exciting. They did their first ever protest. In fact, they occupied a local government building, a FUNAI, Indigenous Affairs Agency building, and they protested there for days and days, and they got quite a lot of media attention because they saw they need to do whatever they can to get the support of the government. They need government agents to accompany their expeditions. They need police. They need environment agents to go with them to strengthen their expeditions. Also because they don't have the legal power to arrest and to take the loggers out of the territory. They can send them out, but they can't keep them in their custody outside. So they need this accompaniment and they need the funding from the government. So they did this protest calling for that. We've publicized that, and we are supporting them in other ways as well. And this work is evolving now, actually.
That's great. Another related question is, how do we protect uncontacted peoples if we don't know anything about them?
It's true that we know very little about uncontacted peoples, but I don't think that's a problem. I think protecting, we don't need to know exactly what language each of them speaks or exactly what their favorite food is, or we don't need to know all these details in order to know that they need their land. That's the one thing that they need in order to survive, which is, I think, been a recurrent theme this evening. So I think it's not a problem that we don't know a lot about them. We need to protect their land. All we need to know is where the invaders are, how to stop them, and we need to make sure the government does that.
So that's why I mentioned that in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one of the strongest, according to several indigenous peoples themselves, is the right to free, prior, and informed consent, which means that you know in advance what's going on, and you have the right to be informed about what's going on, and then you give prior consent to whatever. So I think the question was in that regard too. So if you want to protect their territory, what is the idea of territory that they have? Of course, it's been invaded, it's, there are massacres and all that, but there seems to be, and I think that the guardians could be the providers of this kind of knowledge, with this kind of exchange of information amongst them.
Yes, and I think alongside this right to free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC as it's known, is also the right to self-determination. And some people might say, but how do you know what uncontacted tribes want? But we do know because we see that they point their arrows up at passing planes to show they don't want contact. They leave crossed spears on forest paths. When they encounter others in the forest, people from another tribe or sometimes non-indigenous people, government agents, for example, they will often kind of shout and run away. So it's clear that they don't want contact. And if they did, they could easily make contact. They know exactly what's going on around them. They know their forest intimately. So they could easily make that contact. So that's alongside...
If they wanted to.
Exactly. Yeah. So that's their right to self-determination.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Great. Back to you, Lois. There's a question here about GMOs. And this idea that you brought up of genetically modified organisms, and what does corn become once you engineer it to serve a certain purpose? We know that Monsanto, for example, has developed so-called terminator or suicide seeds that only germinate once, so that you'll have to buy the seeds again. So we know that genetic engineering has caused a lot of harm in the world. So, and here in the United States it's allowed, whereas in Brazil it isn't, right?
The United States is the only country in the world that is allowing genetic modification. Europe, Ukraine, Russia has put a ban on wheat and corn for specific reasons. And I'm pro-science, but I don't see the data that backs what's happening with GMOs. And Native people have always been done selective breeding for instance. Selective breeding is you grow two types of corn. One is a very light blue, one is a very dark blue. You want the darker blue, you save those seeds, you replant them, you eat the light blue. So, and the best way to understand selective breeding is look at a cat or a dog show. They're all dogs, they're all cats, but look at all the different breeds within that species. So food is, plants are the same way. They can be selectively bred. With genetic modification, we're doing an open air experiment. We're inserting genes that have not been tested. Corn is a really good example where there's a gene that if an insect lands on the corn, it's designed so that it blows up the stomach of the insect. Okay, sounds like science. Okay, great. However, if cows eat the corn and you eat the cow, or if you eat the corn that has the gene that blows up the insect's stomach, what does it do to your stomach? Or what does it do to the cow's stomach? And I don't see any data that shows any scientific studies on any of this. And what I do see is millions of digestive problems, from irritable bowel syndrome to Crohn's disease to all of these different things. Everybody's allergic and having major responses. Well, the food is contaminated. So until we have the science, I'm out. I am out. Canola oil, 99.9% guaranteed it's genetically modified. They have destroyed Canada. Destroyed Canada. So you have a choice. You can buy the canola oil and continue to use it, or continue to eat foods used with it, or you can choose a certified organic or an imported oil that is not GMO. So, you know, we have a choice to spend our money where we want and be selective. And it's not quantity. The super size me days are gone, guys. Eat less of a better quality. Less of a better quality. One delicious peach. You don't need the whole GMO pie.
Mm-hmm.
There it is.
Sounds great to me. Very good. Well, just a last question here, because I'm also wondering about that. You mentioned dry farming, and okay that there can be irrigation canals and things like that. I have a very dry garden in Berkeley. Oh, by the way, I wanted to bring up that Berkeley, I think, is the only city in the United States that commemorates not Columbus Day, but Indigenous Peoples Day. So it is a holiday on Monday. And so how do we go about doing dry farming at home, for example? Okay, we have sprinklers and things like that, but does it really work? And what are the foods that best adapt? I know you said that the tapari bean.
So I brought beans for both of the speakers tonight, and I call it the tepary the magic bean. It's a drought-tolerant bean. It's heirloom. So do you guys understand the difference between heirloom and hybrid? No. Heirloom means that it's the ancestral seed. So you can eat it the way it is, but you can also plant it. Hybrid was designed, and this is where GMO comes in, so that every year you would have to buy seeds. Brilliant. On the part of the seed company. Burpee is a great example of hybrid seeds. So every year they're sterile. You cannot replant them. So heirloom is important, but you can look, and there's a great organization in Tucson called Native Seed Search. It's a nonprofit. It has tons of indigenous seeds that you can plant, and if you tell them your zone and what your ecological area is, they will help you decide what seeds are best suited for your ecozone. Makes sense? Using TEK. So it's perfect. So the tepary loves a dry area. If you overwater it, it won't produce beans. Just doesn't, it wants to be stressed, it wants to be dry. Perfect seed for a dry area.
Choose carefully and wisely. Well, I think this has been a great evening. We're running out of time here, and I want to thank the speakers very much and all of you for your attendance. I myself had a great experience here. Thanks so much for coming, and have a great night.